Thanks for being here at the very, very end of
yes.
what for some of us has been quite an epic time, I believe.
Yes.
Doing FOSDEM and this as well. So we're a little cracked out at this point, but bear with us. What I was going to do is just all of us introduce as to how we got involved in regards to open governance. And then we were going to just like talk about our little bit and then open it up to questions. So a fairly fast, furious, but hopefully informative format. I got started with open governance very early on. In fact, I was more attracted to it at first than I was the open source aspects because I was dealing with being an advocate for the ACLU and EFF. So automatically I kind of got more involved in that, and then also watching as the different open source projects rolled out, I got way too many battle scars from things that weren't quite done quite right and things we had to learn and figure out and, progress on. So that's how I got involved.
So my name's Steve Walli. I work for Microsoft in the Azure office of the CTO. I'm also adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins. So I was dragged into the governance debate because there was a number of friends, one of them sitting beside me, suggested that we needed an IEEE standard in this space. And so I am also the working group chair for P3190, which is the new open source software project governance working group.
My name is Florent. Zara. I'm working at the Eclipse Foundation for 1 year now. And in the past, I've been working for 20 years for a software consultancy company, and doing the beginning software quality, checking projects for good quality, technical, and I was also doing open source in my free time and personal time. And then the more and more people ask me to do, open source inside my job to control the open source software they were using. And that's how I get into the open source, let's say, governance at large, first by checking the licenses, the security of the software, and then more and more building OSPO for large companies, doing inner source for them, because sometimes they could not open source software, so they try to do inner source, and then work with the legal department to draft inner source licenses, bringing my technical competency, they bring their legal competency, and then we try to understand each other to draft a license, inner source license. That's how I started to help companies doing good governance on open source, good way, explaining them how community works. And that's now I'm doing this full-time at the Eclipse Foundation.
Awesome. So in regards to good governance, we've all got like different ideas and different concepts on it. And one of the reasons for doing the whole standard part was to basically get those recommended practices down and taking kind of an academia style exercise in regards to it, to bringing everyone together. In fact, our first set of study group meetings, we had over 150 different people attend from all over the open source ecosphere, I guess is a good way of putting it.
It was a little frightening, I have to tell you.
Yes.
Because I know what an IEEE standards working group looks like, and when you have more than 50 people in the room, it gets opinionated.
So, and then Florent, did you want to talk about the work that you're doing right now? That was we're also, because of the fact that we're doing this big tent in regards to it, we're bringing in all of the other different people who have different levels of expertise. And I dragged Florent in because we were working on.
Yes, so the good governance, open source good governance handbook. That's we call it the GGI, Good Governance Initiative. So we drafted this handbook during the OSPO Alliance. With the OSPO Alliance is an informal community of people. We are not incorporated. We are not a official non-profit. But that's a group funded by 4 foundations. That was the OFE, Open from Europe, the Public Code, Foundation for Public Code, the Eclipse Foundation, and OW2 Foundation. So we started together to work on, we wanted to draft something so people can start an OSPO, a full-blown OSPO, and create a full-blown OSPO from scratch. And so we write down the activities they need to achieve, they need to do to build an OSPO and then to run an OSPO. Starting from just knowing what you have inside your company, just because you are using open source, obviously, and then, but you need to know how you are using it at first, and then to create trust, and then to engage your company, then to define a strategy, and everything is now write down into this handbook with 25 activities spread across 5 goals. So give you somehow the path to a good OSPO and to be a good citizen when you are small to large organization, public, private. It has been implemented in the city of Paris, for example, so that's kind of a start. If you do not know where to start, that's a good way to start. A good handbook.
Florent and Stephen?
Yeah, and that was kind of what started to drive some of this broader discussion. I've been around the broad open source community for too many decades now, since long before we called it open source. I've been doing standards, and a lot of folks walk into this with this idea of, well, everybody knows what open source is, and yes, we have a definition, but as soon as you step outside of that, the boundaries of that definition, the discussions get very muddy very quickly. And I was concerned because we were walking into that same space with governance. Governance is basically, if you step back, and I will not try and define it in any kind of structured English way, but governance is really about how a collection of people make decisions about their collective state. That's what it is. And so when you look at this, if we're a small group of the 3 of us working at the heart of an open source project as its maintainers, there's an intimacy in the relationship already. We know each other. That's, we have far fewer things written down. I have the pleasure and privilege of working for Sarah Novotny. Sarah nudged the Kubernetes community into place, that whole architecture of participation, which is now hundreds of people. And you might imagine that when they went from the original 6 developers at Google to hundreds of people, that things have to scale. The nature of that conversation changes. The intimacy changes. Now you have it's like going from the village to town council to you're now a major city of 10 million people. Those structures have different styles of governance, even though you grew that. And so that's what you see in a lot of open source projects. Take a look at the Apache Way. It's a rigorous thing. Eclipse has a phenomenal process. I like doing work as Microsoft in the Eclipse Foundation for precisely that reason. The IEEE, when we build standards, there's a rigor to the way that happens. But you didn't start there. You started in a much smaller place. So that's what I'm hoping that over this next couple of years in the open source software project governance working group, that we can actually get to something where there's a set of recommended practices that you can draw across all of this rich environment of documented process to lift out that skeleton and say, here are the things that you should be doing in your open source project, and relate it back to things like how big are you kind of thing. What are you trying to accomplish? I love this. This document is a wonderful document, but everybody talks about it. Again, this is one of those things where people talk about governance, and this is a situation where I'm trying to get people to think about the difference in project governance through its growth and nonprofit governance. And then you come to this very fine book and they start talking about OSPO governance and governance of the actual asset, of the code. So there's lots of flexibility in the discussion, and it's trying to help people understand what problem are you trying to solve right now.
Definitely. Thanks, Stephen. That's awesome. Yeah, for me, one of the reasons why I thought this was really important is because, kind of watching the transitions that open source has made, right? Because first it was kind of, dev to dev, and it was kind of, people didn't talk about it. It was kind of supported a bit by, academia and government, kind of thing. And then the 2.0 started with businesses getting more and more involved and figuring out the sustainability of that. And once money gets involved, then you have to figure out what your ecosystem looks like so that you get that all addressed correctly. And I feel like now we're entering into this third era of where now governments and foundations and nonprofits and academic institutions are getting back into that piece. And with that comes things like regulations and all those different aspects. And if we don't start defining those things better and in our own language first, that difficulties can ensue.
Well, and that's one of the things that so one of the pieces of work that I do within the Eclipse Foundation right now. So I am Microsoft's board member to Eclipse. But they actually, I'm also the steering committee chair for a working group there. And something that we're seeing more and more of is this rush from new industries that don't have a lot of software collaborative experience, kind of coming into the open source world and kind of saying, that Kubernetes thing, I want one. And then the conversation stops. And so that's why there's a joy of working with the Eclipse Foundation to start to define that kind of work.
What I've seen some large companies like that they don't know where to start. That they don't know who is able to start also. And because you start with, I've often met a virtual OSPO, people who knows open source, who have already worked with open source project, inside open source project, made contribution. And then they say, okay, they said, oh, this is the expert, and in this division, and in another division you can find someone. So they start to build virtual OSPO. They try to find support from a manager, but they don't know where to start, how to go, what arguments, which tool are the right, and how other companies are doing, because they always thought the other guy on the other side of the street is doing better than them. And so that's why we started this book also to write down everything so they know that's not from A to Z. You can just cherry pick what you want to start to, but that's something others are doing also. This is a way to do it. Why are you doing this like this? Because there is people telling me, experts, there is a book of knowledge here, experts are telling us this is the way to go, and this is we can go. These people before that have succeeded. Sorry, my English is the end of the day, but that's something to create trust for them to go from virtual OSPO to a concrete open source program office with tangible realization and with expertise inside a company.
Well, and your point of creating trust, I mean, that's something that's really important right now, especially as you step into some of these new spaces, because there'll be a set of engineers, and they want to talk about process. They want to specify all the things that might go wrong before they go wrong. But then you step into there's a business conversation that gets layered into that, and you have a set of business people that want to understand this investment that we're making. Like, how are we going to measure it so that I can demonstrate value upchain? And then you've got the lawyers layered on the backside, especially for things like compliance, trying to mitigate and manage risk. And all three of them are coming into the room to say, let's have a discussion about governance. And it's, again, that idea of stepping back to find out what the goals are and get everybody's goals out on the table so you can have a real facilitated conversation. So governance is always a fun subject.
Yeah, totally. Because I see, especially the early governance, very much so that developer to developer interaction, right? Where you sit there in the Apache way with the maintainers and the committers and how that works. And it's oh, right, now we're scaling to this other thing. How are you going to handle it now that there's money involved? Now how are we going to handle it when these other things come involved? Now how are we going to handle it when policy and legislation becomes involved? And going forward and figuring that out. And not to mention, I'm also selfish, and I want us to set the tone more for when we start merging these cultures rather than being, dominated perhaps by certain behaviors.
I will have no opinion on this subject.
I know.
But how about the audience? Are there questions that this has started to provoke? Okay, we have a quick hand up.
Okay. Did she go up first?
Sorry.
I don't know which first.
Sorry, Christina. I actually tried to join one of your webinar, but it's so difficult to actually ask questions because, of course, people have opinion, but people also have different questions. I work for an organization which is government funded, and one of our role is to understand how do we enforce open source governance and all the software that's being built in that organization. I think one of the biggest questions I get asked often, and I send people to look at Red Hat, but I would love to learn more from you, is how do you actually commercialize your product while being open source and become sustainable with your own revenue stream generating. So I know it's not deeply about governance, but it also involves quite a lot of how do you set a tone for open source software, which is not just free labor, but also pays for itself.
So I can take a run at that.
Go for it.
So that's a different conversation, and I say that from the perspective of a company needs to know what business it's in with respect to its products and solving a customer problem. And a mistake that you often see that Red Hat never made was kind of shoving projects and products together in the same discussion and not maintaining that very bright line between upstream project work in a community, which is really an infinite game, and downstream product work for a customer, which is a different community, a different discussion, and a highly competitive finite game. And that bright line needs to be maintained and understood throughout a company's culture. Red Hat got very good at that very early. I mean, they were probably 10 years old already and already public. But there was a pivot point where they went from Bob Young's company that he was running the Heinz marketing version of it. When you said Linux, the next words in your head had to be Red Hat. And that's the way Bob ran it. He was very much the best distro company. But they went through a pivot in about 2002, 2003, where they realized we're actually an enterprise software company and we're cheap Unix on Intel at that explosive growth of the web. And it changed the way they behaved as a company and the relationship to their customers. And they left the rest of the distro companies in the dirt that we're still trying to figure out why am I not the best distro? And it's that understanding of the business so that can define how your healthy business is still engaged in all of these projects. I think it was Paul Cormier. I always want to say Cormier because it looks like a French name to me. Paul Cormier, as they were being swallowed into IBM, said, we're not an open source company. We're an enterprise software company that has an open source knowledgeable engineering team. And they always maintain that very bright line. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but...
That's just, if I can add something, but the Eclipse Foundation, what we are doing is we have, as Stephen said, a governance, a strong governance, and this governance, that allow the actors, the competitors to work on a common platform. And then with shared services we provide at the foundation, just like the IP management, the technical platform, the security. And then on top of that platform, just the best example maybe is the historical Eclipse IDEA, but we are doing much more than that. And then they are creating their product, their solution, their services on top of that platform. And then this is kind of what you call the competitive line, where they create value for their customers, and this is where happens the competition. But below that, we have a common platform. They can work together, collaborate together, and this is what we ensure with our governance, strong governance that has proven to work for years, that they can collaborate, and we ensure that the software is sustainable, because if someone wants to leave or wants to go by itself, it can't proprietarize the solution. It's still open to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect of doing that is for some of the different things is talking about governance on different levels. There is corporate governance, right, where there are some open source projects that are dominated.
Don't forget this question.
Yep. Sorry. Yeah. But also making sure that you have the consensus building tools to make sure that all the corporations can go together.
Hello, thank you. So I'm an open source newbie, but I'm studying the ethics of AI. So I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts about the ethical uses of open source. Like, should bad actors be prevented from using open source, for example? And if so, how could that be reflected in the governance?
That's a tough question.
There was a session about that yesterday, so yes, I'm just left with a lot of questions.
I was there.
Do you have an opinion on this? We have an excellent speaker in the audience.
Sorry, no, I do have an opinion about it. It's something I wrote about in my book, as it turns out. I think the problem is that as soon as you start saying that, nobody gets to decide. As soon as it's a personal view about what is good and what is bad, you are bringing ethics into something which will always be grey. And it's almost impossible to set up a governance structure, in my opinion, in an open source, or almost any endeavor, frankly, where everyone is going to agree. And so I think it's a difficult decision sometimes, I think. I work in security, and I've done things which I know could be used by governments I don't approve of, or frankly by terrorists, or by whatever. That's always been the case with encryption, and I think we have the greater good generally. And I don't want to play David Hume here, but the greater good is generally making it open. On the whole, I think that's the best. If you decide and other people make a different decision, how can you stop them? That's the other thing. Particularly,
Mike's book, he needs to plug it directly instead of kind of from the side. He wrote a book on trust. It's a fabulous book on trust and technology. But the ethics question gets very messy very quickly. And we go through it in open source. Like every 10 years, we have this debate again as enough of one generation leaves and a new generation comes in and wants to have that exact discussion again. And it's a good discussion to have. And it's always a good discussion to refresh. But it's a hard discussion to come up with the way that you would control it outside of the license. And maybe your idea is the place to have that next discussion is to leave the license alone and have it actually as a governance discussion within the organizations and the nonprofits and the government engaged organizations, kind of away from the definition of open source. Because that's where it invariably lands as somebody tries to say the license should change. And it's like, well, once you crack that discussion open, I can tell you the names of the very large corporations with patent portfolios that would love to change that definition too. And again, it just opens into a broader discussion where nobody's going to win. But I think your idea of starting that discussion in a governance in a nonprofit space is a good place to evolve it.
I can't help but put in a plug. Ethicsanddesign.IEEE.org is our free and open standard 7000 series, where they're going about addressing some of those issues in a bunch of different verticals and things of that nature. In fact, when it just got cited in the EC's white paper on ethical AI. So some of that stuff is kind of being addressed there, and I would suggest checking some of that out and seeing what that is and what the processes are for doing that, as to how they go through and do it. And I feel like we're doing some similar stuff in regards to how we've been structuring the standard for ours going forward too, where it's shoulds, not always necessarily musts, and going from that angle first and then figuring out the other portions after that.
This is something too subjective to be, for me, to be included in the governance right now, especially in the Eclipse governance. That's something that won't be integrated for the time being, yes.
Yeah, when I say that I'm chairing a standards working group, we're building a recommended practices document. And to put that in perspective for the audience, a full-blown IEEE standard is full of shoulds, full of shalls. You shall do this, you shall do this, you shall do this to conform to the standard. If you have a guide, it's full of mays. You may do this, you may do that. Recommended practices sit in the middle. It's you should be doing this. And I felt confident that at this point, we have comfortably 40 years of experience in collaborative endeavors since they layered copyright onto computer software, where we can have a discussion about what are the differences between something that is merely licensed as open source and rich, thriving, vibrant communities. Like where do those shoulds land that encourage that kind of vibrancy? And I'm not talking even about growth. I'm talking about vibrancy. I tend to have a different set of metrics in a lot of these discussions. So I'm happy to talk about that outside of this discussion. Other questions?
One is emerging.
Yeah.
Kind of maybe building off of a comment you'd said earlier about this kind of intergenerational nature of the conversation. I'm wondering how your discussions around governance have kept this intergenerational conversation in mind. Because on one hand, as someone that works with an open source community and folks who have been a part of the movement for decades, but also people that are just starting to get into it, the way in which open source has to be open for beginners, but also very much continue conversations that have been happening for decades. I'm wondering how in the context of governance you're thinking about it intergenerationally. Is there room for beginners that are asking the same kind of questions, rehashing them, or is it something that folks who have been in the space for a very long time should be should be creating those shoulds or recommended practices that the rest of us can kind of fall behind.
Well, just went to Boston. That was awesome, by the way.
Yeah.
So many young people. I've never seen so many women. When old timer, first OSCON, 1.5% women. I would estimate it was close to 30. So that was pretty amazing to see. And one of the things that I've noticed is in regards to, so I think we definitely do have a pretty wide range on the thing that's coming in and participating. But one of the things that I've kind of noticed, working a lot with a lot of young people, is they've already got so much of that baked in, coming out of the university settings where they are, like you're teaching open source at Johns Hopkins and doing different things of that nature, where so many of the development processes, so much of the, like we had a very young Android team at PayPal, and I didn't have to coach them. They knew, because it just seems that like so much of the new generation that's coming up already has so much of this in their tool set that it's very different, I believe, with the digital natives.
Yeah, I think the two challenges that I've seen, one of them just building that community. One of the really interesting discoveries that Sarah and I had as we were debating this is there are pieces of the Kubernetes community that are becoming factional. And there was that aha moment that as good as she was at defining, kind of nudging collaborative governance into place, she was Gen 1, she handed it off to Gen 2, but the thing she didn't teach was how to hand it off to Gen 3. And Gen 3 is getting factional. And there was that aha moment of, right, culture needs to be transmitted across as people come and go. That's some of what I'm discovering as I talk to younger and younger generations is they have the energy and they have the desire, but they haven't necessarily got a language for how you have that cooperative discussion. And there's almost that and it's, to me, it's a lack of experience, but I don't mean gray-haired experience like mine. I mean just the simple lack of experience of at what point in your career did you suddenly realize you had to behave differently yourself in a set of expectations, in a set of people trying to accomplish something, and even figuring out what your common goals were. And that's a set of lessons that I'm hoping that we can find some of that in the recommended practices as kind of guideposts, so that anybody coming into this, I mean, the other community, it was a joy showing up at that festival in Africa, but it was also terrifying because I was the 60-year-old guy in a sea of 1,000 people that he said 25. I'd be amazed if that was the average age. I mean, I thought they were all like 22. And like there was so much energy and so many people, so many hands doing things. And it's just trying to find the way to kind of say, here's some useful stepping stones along the way, so they don't have to learn it the hard way.
And I have noticed that it does reflect in tools too, because all the young people want to be in chat, all the older people want the email list.
As is right.
So I was wondering if any of the panel felt that maybe, I mean, obviously there are something, you talked about digital natives, and there are some stereotypes that we hear about digital natives. They don't care about their personal data, for instance, they'll give it away. But on the other hand, maybe there's a different view about sort of nationhood, and more people, we hear the younger generation, more care about issues than sort of states. And I wondered whether there's something about foundations and about their they're generally let's say more international, less nationhoodness that is attractive to maybe new generations. Or maybe I'm making this up completely, but it's just it feels like more of an issue thing than belonging is about there rather than about where you come from. It's about the project or about the foundation. Or am I deluded?
So, being an occasional member of the BTS Army, do any of y'all know what that is?
No.
I just showed y'all the generational divide right there, didn't I? The BTS Army, they're a K-pop group, and
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. There's a whole different ones, that are that are going on, and they do a lot of activism that maybe people don't always know about or always hear about. Like they purposely really pranked Trump a lot and like took away a bunch of resources and did a bunch of different things along those lines. And so I think that kind of like exemplifies, you know, some of that is happening and going on, and that oftentimes, you know, when I was at Hyperledger, there was some people who thought that the Chinese group wasn't doing anything, and I'm like, yeah, but you're not on WeChat. I'm on WeChat, so I know what, you know, and I think so many times there's having to figure out what that interoperability is going to be so that you can have that intersectionality and how to get that information to cross sometimes those technological barriers is crucial.
A lot of what I try and do, so I have too much experience in this space. I have too much gray hair. I always follow the money. And I don't follow the money in any kind of a hostile sense. It's a matter of once you understand how the money flows, you can understand how to enable work to happen and how to support that work in a richer environment. My job in certain corners where I'm a working group chair in other organizations, my job is about running boring budgets to be able to say yes to people that want to do work. But you have to understand how that money flows. And if you don't, and that's where things start to go from issues and people's interest in issues into actually allowing them to succeed. And I don't know how to do that yet for something like this recommended practice. That said, we have a very senior member of the IEEE in the audience right now. I will reiterate my job as an IEEE Standards Working Group Chair is merely facilitate a discussion amongst a rich group of individual experts in the industry to ensure that we arrive at the right standard.
You know, the Eclipse...
How about a decent implementable standard?
We have a question over here?
Yeah, I have a question, but Florent, go ahead. You were going to comment.
No, go on.
So a lot of questions from this side because we've been talking about governance for like a year now, and we have lots of community who are grassroots we're working with who are also implementing governance in different countries, different continents altogether. And we talk about the fluidity or spectrum of governance and how it evolves and how you need to adopt with time. How do you decide? Like that's a huge decision-making nightmare, right? Because we're thinking about solving decision-making problem, but at the same time they evolve. They also face the cultural resistance of like, oh, but you said yesterday this is how we're going to make decision. You're changing it now. How do we do that kind of transition in governance?
I would welcome your participation in a particular working group right now.
The spectrum of governance.
But yes, and that's the thing that I think is to me really interesting because so many new companies, new players are coming into this open source discussion, and they're all like, we need governance. And then they look around and they go, Kubernetes has governance. And then they lift it up and they realize, oh my God, that's a lot of governance, and they put it back down again. And people are looking for this idea of somehow there's this single list of governance. And what you just said is the reality of it starts off with a small conversation amongst a small group of people, and as people join, assuming everything is flowing in a good direction, the governance evolves. And that's why you can't pick up the Kubernetes governance and drop it down over here, because that discussion evolved in a very different way than yours might. And so like that, if you've been having that discussion for a year now, I would love somebody to even give us pointers in a direction for things that we could read. So I know how to find you now.
That's also the experience we have at the Eclipse Foundation. You know, we have a strong governance, kind of conservative. So, but at the beginning, it was really easy for contributors. You know, we just said RTFM, the governance is there, the handbook, just follow it. But right now, that's why also I'm here. My work at the foundation is to help the newcomers, the new big industry, the new players, to understand and to point them and to take them by the hand through our governance and through the project for the project to work, because they say we want to do the governance. Oh yes, there is a governance, that's nice, but we don't want to use it, and it's too complicated to use it. Where to look? So that's why that's part of my job, to guide the newcomers and these big companies wanting to play with open source, to go through our governance and to collaborate with each other in the smoothest way possible.
And that's something that I've really enjoyed over this last couple of years as I get reacquainted with the IEEE, I'm doing more with Eclipse, is those are two organizations with a certain amount of depth and rigor in their governance systems, but each of them, the first thing they do as part of the engagement is there's suddenly staffers that understand that governance wrapped around you as you lift one of these new efforts into place. And that's, I don't work with Florent directly, I work with other program managers in the Eclipse space, but it's been an amazing kind of journey into starting this working group. We've seen the same thing in certain projects. The IEEE, the first thing I was told is, you will need to take this course. And they suggest that it's a few hours. What they mean is 16. And then I had a very knowledgeable IEEE program manager wrapped around me to make sure that we started the study group appropriately. So there's ways in with a rich governance at a certain level, but I think the more interesting thing is exactly what you were talking about of the evolution.
And there's also a bit of an art in regards to merging the different cultures too, right? Because we do have a very established culture in regards to that, having many battle scars and things of that nature, and then merging it in with open source, where open standard and open source are not equivalent phrases, okay? They're really not. And overcoming some of those different cultural differences is interesting.
Absolutely.
You should see the talk from Simon Phipps about differences between open standard and open source. Really instructive.
WebMink.
Yeah, WebMink, yeah.
Yeah, Simon's great. So I have a small question for the distinguished panel. The word governance, when I worked in certain organizations previously, I started getting pushback against the word governance. Negative connotations, yada, yada, yada. Is it a word that we should use? Is it a word that is representative of all the myriad of activities a governance might encounter and encompass?
It's a useful word, but that's where I'm. There are certain things. Christian's being very leading in this discussion because he's in the IEEE working group. Just so we're all clear.
No. False news.
But that's part of the fun of what we're going to build, is to tease out without getting caught too deep in the rat hole of what's the definition of governance, but to still provide enough of a definition there, and then using the structure of the rest of the document to provide helpful things there. So hopefully, when somebody sees governance in our document, they won't confuse it with the governance in that document, and the documents will stand on their own.
And that's a
nicely
handbook.
answered.
As fast as I can
nicely
tap
answered.
dance,
That's why we call this also a handbook. That's not a governance, by itself. You can use it to build a governance if you want, but that's.
Yeah. But we are at time, folks. In fact,
well
well past time.
Yeah. Are you willing to take one more? There was one hand up. Yeah.
It was me, and it was more of a comment. But I made an offhand joke off mic about I'd be satisfied with a decent implementable standard. But I think this question about governance makes me want to make a related comment on mic, and that is I don't care what you call it. Any standard, practice, guideline is de facto useless if it's not implementable. So actually, implementability is a key to any standard, and or practice or guideline or open source project, right? So what the result is has to be implementable. Now, is it going to be universally implementable? I'm not looking to build the one project to own them and quote token, but implementability is key, and I think as long as a group working on a project like the standards project, like the foundations project, like many open source projects in the room, is focused on making it implementable for their communities, you'll get good results. Thank you.
Any final words from the panel?
Thank you all for your time today, and thank you for staying late with us.
Thanks for being interested in staying late with us.
Yeah, part of the conversation.
Yeah. Thanks again to all our speakers.